Hi class. Today the lecture is going to be over the book titled Unclean. Try to get that on the screen here for you. It's by Richard Beck. Richard Beck is a Christian psychologist. He works at Abilene Christian University. And he actually has an entire research project that has about 4 books associated with it. And the way I would describe Richard Beck's research project is he is researching and writing about psychological barriers to the Christian life. What are the things that make it hard for humans, the psychological mechanisms, modules, behaviors that make it hard for us to be Christian? So Unclean is all about disgust, but he's written a book called Slavery to Death, and it's about how we have a natural propensity to fear death. So my fear of death can manifest itself very obviously, like I don't want to die, I'm going to protect myself. But it can also be I don't like change. All change is a kind of death. One thing ends, another thing begins. I resist change, right? I resist getting older, feeling frail, being vulnerable. These are all kinds of forms of fearing death and my own aging, my own dependence on others. So this very natural biological mechanism, fearing death, makes it hard for me to be really Christian, right? Because the message of the cross is death does not get the last word, life gets the last word. I don't have to fear death anymore because of the resurrection of Christ, and I will participate in that resurrection. Therefore, I can live without fear. I can live free to love radically, even if it means my own demise. I can love selflessly, right? Broken and poured out for the world. The fear of death keeps me from loving and serving and being selfless in those ways. So it makes it hard for me to be Christian. So he writes a book about that. He's written a wonderful book called Stranger God. That's all about hospitality, welcoming the stranger, and the different psychological mechanisms that make it hard for us to be really hospitable. So we talked about Jonathan Haidt and the moral foundations. One of them is in-group versus out-group. So as soon as I judge someone as part of my in-group, I'm much kinder to them. I'm more likely to share and trust them naturally. My elephant is more trusting towards them, right? That can be as simple as the same race as me, the same gender, the same ethnic group, the same sports fan, right? Like imagine going into a party and it's all women, there's only one man. I'm going to look and find him and talk to him a little bit, right? Like I think maybe I'll have more in common with him. Like there's a sense of familiarity, like, oh good, I'm not the only guy here, right? If I was in a place where I was around only African American people and there was one other white person, I might want to talk to that person too, right? Like, well, I feel comfortable now that there's at least someone who's like me. Or I want to find the other Yankee fans or other Mets fans, right? Now we have something in common. We're like an in-group now. So we tend to give preference and trust and seek out people that are like us. We're skeptical, hesitant, competitive, maybe even exclusionary towards people we deem to be part of the out-group. Well, this in-group, out-group mechanism is biological. It's very natural, right? This is why racism is so natural. Tribalism is so natural. Misogyny and sexism is so natural. Nationalism, USA, right? So natural. We're tribal by nature. We're in-group by nature. And so that is something that we come biologically equipped to do, is to find a team, a tribe, a group. But as Christians, I'm called to love my neighbor, whoever that might be, as myself. That God doesn't love one race more than another, or one sports team versus another, or one gender over another. We're all children of God, and so I'm called to love without bias. I'm supposed to care as much for the life of the Afghanistan civilian as I do for the U.S. troop, right? As a Christian. The kingdom of God doesn't have borders in that way. Well, I've got a psychological mechanism that wires me to care about my family and my friends in my in-group more than out-group. I've got a Christian call that says I'm supposed to love my neighbor as myself, and so this is a psychological barrier to the Christian life, to being hospitable to everyone. The Bible has a lot to say about in-group, out-group. Jews, Gentiles, right? Samaritans, Philistines. Wherever the Jewish people want to draw that circle, God says draw it wider. Yes to Gentiles. Yes to Samaritans, right? And so The Stranger God is a great book about hospitality. The book Unclean that you're going to be reading is all about disgust. That disgust is a very universal human emotion, right? It seems that only humans have it, but we all have it. And it's usually related to food, where you crinkle your nose and you think, oh, right? So it's most heavily triggered by smell, by food, things that kind of gross us out, bodily fluids like, vomit, blood, other kinds of things, feces. So those kinds of things make us want to stay away, and it's really evolutionarily helpful, very adaptive, because you're not going to put contaminated meat into your body and get sick, right? You're not going to be around things like feces or vomit or dead bodies, things that we naturally feel disgust towards, because being around those things makes me more likely to get sick, right? Vomit is a carrier of disease, and so is feces in terms of bacteria, and dead bodies, of course. So it's good to sort of feel that disgust and avoid those things. On page 19 of your text, right, Unclean, Beck highlights 3 types of disgust, right? 3 major types he wants to explore in the book. Core disgust, which is food and smell, right? There's socio-moral disgust, and this is where there are moral offenses or particular groups even that might trigger like, oh, why would you do that, right? Like, or do you know what those kinds of people eat or do or where they live? And you can begin to attach kind of that same disgust that you might have with a smell to groups of people or to particular actions that you find to be gross, right? So it's kind of a moral judgment that gets made because of disgust. And then third, animal reminder disgust, things that might be about gore, blood, deformity, certain animals like rats or poor hygiene, right? So these 3 different types of disgust, kinds of triggers that make me feel disgust, are very universal. We find them in all cultures. So all cultures find some foods disgusting and some smells disgusting, but they're not all the same. Some people in some groups think one thing might smell bad, another group it's different, but all of us will have some things we find disgusting when it comes to food and smell. All of us will find some things disgusting related to gore, bodily fluids, dead bodies, other kinds of things. It changes from culture to culture, but there's going to be something in those categories, certain animals that are deemed unclean. For us in the United States, it's often rats, things like that. And then every culture will have certain moral actions that trigger disgust. It might not be the same from religion to religion or culture to culture, but there will be this kind of socio-moral disgust. But this is where I'm the most interested. Jonathan Haidt makes the argument and gives lots of data that my elephant is doing a lot of the moral judgment, my automatic, very fast processing system. When I feel disgust, when I crinkle up my nose, I make certain moral judgments. I become more judgmental. I judge things negatively when they trigger my disgust. Some of the research that I cited in previous lectures, like if you've been hypnotized to have a particular disgust word, then when you hear that word, you become more judgmental in a negative way. Or think about this study about the fart spray. If you fill out those moral vignettes near the fart spray, you end up being more harsh with the punishments than if you fill that same survey out near a bakery where it smells good. The trigger of disgust affects my elephant and makes me more judgmental in a negative way, right? So this very natural disgust meter, disgust detector, that is beneficial in some ways, keeping me away from contaminated food and whatnot, also is maladaptive, and it makes it really hard for me to be Christian in other areas, right? If certain people, if certain groups, if certain smells trigger my disgust, and that makes me more judgmental, then I'm going to be judgmental. I'm going to judge those people, those actions, as being immoral, maybe even unchristian. I will avoid those people, which means I'm not participating in hospitality or welcoming. I'm sort of happy when they don't sit by me or go their own way, right? So disgust creates a psychological barrier. I think Christians need to become aware of it. I feel disgust at certain groups, certain people, certain actions, certain smells, certain foods, certain things. And sometimes that makes it hard for me to really love my neighbor well, to be welcoming. It makes it hard for churches and Christian communities to do this. The more we become aware that it's happening, that my elephant is responding this way, the better we can get at overcoming it, right? And maybe you can think of some of these examples, but I'll mention a few. So our church is attempting to feed the homeless, but one of the barriers for a lot of people is the way that homeless people smell. So they often have poor hygiene, which evokes disgust, the grease in their hair, do they have lice, the clothing is dirty, and so now they're going to come sit in the church chairs down by our kitchen area, eat there, right? Am I going to offer them a handshake? Am I going to offer them a hug? I do this for other church parishioners, right? But I'm more standoffish. And for lots of Christians, that's true, right? And so that standoffishness is perceived by those that are homeless, so they don't feel quite welcome. Like, can I come into the sanctuary during worship? Am I welcome to be here or there? It makes us slightly less friendly, slightly less open with our affection, with our hugs, with our touch. And so that's tricky. I know that there are lots of Christians who, again, yeah, let's go out and feed the homeless, great. I don't really want them sitting next to me in church. I don't want to sit during Sunday with that smell or with that dirt, right? So that's one way it becomes a barrier. It means that I don't want to go to those neighborhoods or those areas where that's happening, right? I want to avoid that. So I think that this plays a bigger role in the Christian life than we might think otherwise. One of the reasons I think that Christians have a hard time, at least I do, and lots of Christians I know have a hard time, being judgmental, is that I think that sin in many respects triggers that in me. Not all sins. Often sins I can relate to don't trigger my disgust because I participate in them, or I at least am tempted to. But things that people do that I'm not tempted to do, or that are foreign to me, often will like trigger that kind of response, like, what? Right? So I think for lots of Christians, homosexuality is an issue that for many people, like the thought of it, like, oh, how could you be with another man? Or how could two women be together? And it sort of triggers a kind of disgust. And that makes us more judgmental on that particular lifestyle or that particular set of actions than we are, for instance, about people who spend money, live in luxury, buy luxury automobiles, have multiple houses. I mean, the Bible mentions using money to live a luxurious lifestyle as sinful. That's a sinful lifestyle. But lots of Christians do it. Lots of Christians live luxurious lifestyles while other people don't have enough to eat. The Bible has more to say about money and what to do with money than it does about homosexuality, right? But spending money in luxury does not trigger our disgust at all. Like, I'm tempted to want to do that. I want to live a comfortable life and go on vacation, and right? So I don't pay as much attention to wealth and how it's being used. But when it comes to sexuality, and in particular homosexuality, there is a kind of a triggering of my elephant that makes me focus on it more, makes often Christians more judgmental in that area. So even though a sin is a sin is a sin, we don't treat it that way. And I think a lot of it is how our elephants are triggered by certain sins and not others, right? So not just homosexuality, but like promiscuity, infidelity, sexual sins in general pique our interest. I think sometimes they trigger our disgust and they make us more judgmental on those things as opposed to others, right? Maybe one thing Christians could do is, instead of trying to judge everything equally harsh, right? Maybe instead we need to provide a kind of universal grace, that our job is to love and to welcome and to embrace, and God's job is to judge. But that's a very hard thing when I get triggered, especially with disgust or other feelings. Like, hey, that's immoral. You can't do that, right? In chapter 2, there's a particular kind of logic that Richard Beck talks about. It's called contamination logic. And this is something that, again, is very biological. It's very universal. And that is, if you have something that's clean and you have something that's dirty, and they come into contact, the clean thing is made dirty. It is contaminated. The dirty thing is not made clean. So if I rub an apple in the dirt, the apple does not make the dirt taste good. The dirt makes the apple gross. The apple's been contaminated, not the dirt, and so it works one direction. The clean thing becomes dirty, right? So it's like the logic of contamination. And they do all kinds of fun research. A glass of juice, would you have a sip? They do yes. They dip a cockroach in the juice. Will you drink it now? No, that's gross. Okay, we're going to take the juice, we're going to boil it, we're going to put it through a filter system, it's going to be totally clean, no germs. Will you drink it now? No. Logically, this is clean juice. In fact, this juice has less contamination because it's been boiled than the juice I drank initially. But I watched you stick a cockroach in there, and for me, that's enough. I'm not drinking it, right? There's a great study called the Hitler's sweater study, and they bring people into the lab, and there's this old ratty sweater from the 1940s, and they say this sweater was owned by Hitler, and then they ask participants if they'll put it on. Will you put the sweater on? And no, like, of course not. Why? And there's a feeling, an elephant intuition, that this sweater has moral cooties. It was worn by someone evil. And the feeling is, if I put it on, it's contagious. It will rub off on me. I don't want it near me, right? So we've taken something very normal, disgust, that food is gross, get it away from me, that's good. But now all of a sudden we attach it to people, we attach it to clothing, we attach it to actions. Very interesting, right? And so I don't want to come in contact because I think this sweater might be contagious and I might catch it, right? Again, I think that has happened with homosexuality in the United States. If I come in contact with someone who's gay, all of a sudden, like, will I catch it? Could my children? There's like this fear of contagion, which is totally irrational, but it's real. But then let's think about how the church often reacts to sinners, people who are sinful, right? So Jesus eats with sinners, and the Pharisees are like, how could you do that? Jesus, you will become unclean. You won't be able to go to the temple, right? You're touching lepers. You're eating with prostitutes. These are sinful people. You need to keep them away from you. So the Jewish faith had a strong notion of contagion. We will get unclean. These people will make us dirty. But then Jesus says, that's not the call of God. The call of God is to embrace, to bring in, to hug, to love. And so you have to overcome your feelings of disgust, of contagion, that sinful people will rub off. You will catch it, right? So we've got to get over that, such that where else should broken people be except church? I'm sinful. I'm broken. I'm glad I'm welcome. Well, then we need to invite others in that we might think of as like, oh, but if we allow them in, then what? And I'm not just talking about sexuality stuff. I'm talking about addicts. I'm talking about people who've been out of jail. I'm talking about people carry around these stains like, oh, felon, check. I'm not going to rent to you. I don't want to hire you. Contagion. Stay away, right? And Jesus says we go to set prisoners free. We welcome those on the outside. Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me. Go to the marginalized, the tax collector and the prostitute, and make sure they're loved, children of God. So we have to overcome this psychological barrier that wants to remove people that are sinful as though they will make us contagious, right? Like Hitler's sweater. I'm going to catch moral cooties from you. The logic of Jesus is when Jesus touches the leper, Jesus isn't made dirty. They're made clean, whole. Jesus isn't made dirty by the sinner. They're provided grace and love. Well, the church has to be the place that says, we're not going to be made dirty by you. You're going to be made clean by God, right? And this is a place for you. So we've got to overcome some of these psychological barriers to the Christian life, to what it means to be truly Christian. I've got to get over my elephant that wants to say, you have moral cooties. I'm going to keep you at arm's length. I'm going to judge you more harshly than I judge myself. I'm going to judge those groups, those religions, those outsiders more harshly. But this is often the case. There's some interesting studies. There's a Dixie Cup study. And essentially it is, you take 30 minutes during a lecture and you just, instead of swallowing, you spit what you would swallow into a Dixie cup, which is kind of gross. And then the Dixie cup slowly fills up. And then at the end of the 30 minutes, the offer is, now will you drink the Dixie cup full of your own spit? And most people will not do this. That is like, no, I'm not drinking that. Why? You were going to drink that much saliva during this 30 minutes, so you were going to swallow that saliva anyway. You just put it into a cup, now swallow it. What's the difference, right? When the saliva is in my body and I'm swallowing it and I don't see it, it's not disgusting. The moment it is out of my body in a cup, it's gross. It's kind of like a hair. Hair on my head, cool. A hair anywhere else is gross. A hair on my toothbrush, a hair in my food, a hair, right, like on the counter. All that hair is disgusting unless it's on someone's head. Why? Same hair, right? And so, on my body, okay. Off my body, not okay. Now it's gross. So now I want you to think about a couple of things. Natural triggers, in-group, out-group. Part of us, not part of us. Inside the circle, outside the circle. People like me in my group, in my circle, that are like me. I'm graceful. I don't judge them as harshly. Them, when they do it, now, why would they do that? They're so selfish. They're so deluded, etc. We save our forms of grace for what is inside, and we are judgmental and harsh on the outsider. Jesus reverses this logic. If you read the Gospels over and over and over again, Jesus saves his harshest criticisms for the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious insiders, those who were in the know, who claim to be like, yes, we are religious. And Jesus' greatest forms of mercy, forgiveness, and grace are for outsiders. It is for the prostitute, the woman caught in adultery, right? So Jesus gives grace to the religious outsider and judgment for the religious insider. But many Christians have reversed it. We give our greatest forms of grace to each other and to other Christians, and our greatest form of judgment is to the outgroup, the other. We've reversed. So Jesus wants us to overcome some of these psychological barriers, to be more faithful. So this logic of contagion, I think, is pervasive. We don't want to be exposed to anything that might make us impure or bad or wrong. We don't want our kids to be exposed to anything like that. We feel like there's contagion around every corner. Now, I'm not suggesting to be foolish. The things I put in my life affect me, change me, impact my decisions. So that's obviously true. But as Christians, we're not called to run from the world. We're not called to isolate in some dramatic way. But in fact, we have to be able to engage the world well. and to love even our enemies, even our outgroup members. And to do that, we're going to need to overcome some of these elephant biological intuitional hurdles related to disgust. I hope this is helpful. If you have any questions at all, let me know, and I'll see you guys online.